this is a difficult topic, just because material culture keeps changing. So the whole problem is about what kind of change can signal crisis. And for this, I propose first to give some definition of what is first a crisis. So if I understood, okay, it works. So crises are defined by historians as brief conjectural events which can be caused by different sorts of events like external invasions or economic collapses with various effects in terms of reactions and consequences. When they are followed by changes in the people sociology, they affect the long-term history. And this change, which are one expression of crisis, are defined as discontinuous, as Ilaria recalled very nicely, as opposed to continuous changes. And continuous changes refer to circumstantial changes occurring on the middle or short-term history. They do not affect, in this regard, the sociological structure of the population. Transitional periods, which are also called periods of trouble, are generally viewed as an aftermath of crisis. In archaeology, transitional periods are defined as taking place in between, before and after culturally well-identified periods on the basis of sets of traits whose intersite differentiation draws spatio-temporal contours enabling to characterize social groups and therefore the population structure that we can define as configurations where groups differ from each other due to low intra-group variability and strong inter-group variability. According to this archaeological definition, transitional periods corresponds then mainly to transformations characterized by a form of disorder, which contrasts with the previous or future order, often characterized by a form of uniformity or clear-cut differentiated tradition. And as a result, in fact, periods of transition are particularly difficult to interpret in terms of population structure, and hence, I guess, the expression of period of trouble. I mean, trouble not only for ancient populations, but also trouble for the archaeologists. So in this paper, I propose to address the question of the ceramic traditions as markers, on the one hand, of sociological changes and therefore crises, on the other hand, of transitional periods and therefore transformations blurring the anthropological reading of the material culture. Before, I will recall that technological tradition, here defined as inherited ways of doing, are strong markers of population structure because, said very briefly, the learning process implies a learner and a tutor, and tutors are always from close social circles. As a result, at the micro level, learners practice the same way than the tutors and the members of the social group she belongs to. And at the macro level, technological traditions are then transmitted within circumscribed social circles, delimiting technological clusters made up of socially close individuals. These technological clusters indicate transmission networks and thus the population structure. However, ethnographic data show well that the spatial distribution of technical features doesn't match necessarily social boundaries, testifying to diffusion across social boundaries, not to mention the history of techniques, which is also a history of both innovation and context that have directly contributed to the diffusion of technical traits of a wide geographical area. So the challenge here It's to characterize the technological change signaling crisis and understand how they can result in a form of technological disorder. Knowing that the learning transmission mechanism has for effect at a macro scale the forming of technological clusters along social boundaries, I will first consider as a regularity that the disappearance or the appearance of technical traditions indicate change in the sociology of potters and the transmission chain, that is, discontinuous change and in this regard crisis. So one salient example of discontinuous change is the repeated disappearance and appearance of the wheel fashioning technique in the southern Levant. It disappeared by early Bronze I, following the collapse of the late Chalcolithic chiefdoms, reappeared during the early Bronze II, III along the first urbanization, disappeared again by the early Bronze IV with the collapse of the cities, and reappeared by the Middle Bronze Age II. So in order to show how change in technological traditions indicate discontinuous changes, and therefore change in the population sociology, I will recall very briefly results obtained from the analysis of ceramic assemblages dated to the early Bronze IV and early Middle Bronze, and which have been already published and that Ilaria has already introduced in a way. So, ceramic traditions, well, no. So the early Bronze IV period, so is characterized by the disappearance of the fortified cities and towns which had characterized the first period of urbanization of South Levant. The typical settlement became once again an open village. The populations were supposed, depending on the regions, to be rural and semi-sedentary, as suggested by the short lifespan of the sites and the burial customs. Ceramic traditions have been examined on sites of different sizes and located in different ecological settings. Ceramic traditions are all characterized by handmade forming techniques, whatever the size of the vessels, be it small open vessels or big closed vessels, and whatever the function, lamps, jars, jugs, cooking pots. No surface features indicate the use of a rotary device. The general lack of symmetry of numerous vessels suggests a low production. Variability of clay material points to various places of production, while the typological variation between the regional pottery groups expresses the different social groups forming the fragmented social landscape of the early Bronze IV period. So these different features suggest local household productions. By the beginning of the second millennium BC, Palestine witnesses radical changes. Numerous early Bronze IV sites disappear, and new settlements ranging from hamlet to real cities expand. Along with the cities, huge earthen ramparts and monumental building appears. So the MBA is represented on, meaning the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, is represented on sites located on the coastal plain and or the inland valleys. So the MB2B, meaning the period following the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, saw a general trend of settlement expansion into new territory, as in the Jordan Valley. On the whole, material culture, and pottery in particular, shows a great deal of continuity from beginning to end. The repertoire of shapes is quite uniform, large majority of types being very much the same form from south to north. From the beginning of the period, we've looked at the material from Tel Ifshar, which is one of the rare sites of this period, presenting material in stratified context. And for the MB2B period, we have examined the material from Bethshan, whose petrography and typology had been previously studied in detail. At Ifshar, from the first occupation onward, ceramic material is characterized by an extensive use of the wheel-forming technique, which is used for the manufacture of a broad range of morphological types, from bowl to jar. The shapes of the wheel-shaped vessels are mostly northern Levant style inspired. At Betchean, the same way, the great majority of the vessels are wheel-coiled, whereas the coiled vessels are restricted to storage vessels, pitoi, and cooking pots. Clay paste analysis suggests that the wheel-coiled ceramic production was carried out in different specialized workshops. As far as the rotary tool is concerned, no wheel has been found on these two sites, but the type of wheel associated to the Middle and Late Bronze Age is the one originating from Mesopotamia and which reached the southern Levant from the north. The Palestine tournette, which was prevailing in the southern Levant from the 5th up to the 3rd millennium BC, is indeed not anymore in use in this part of the Near East. So on one side, we have a Middle Bronze Age tradition characterized by the complex wheel coiling technique tournette, northern style-shaped vessel, originating probably from the north and carried out by specialized craftsmen. On the other side, we have an early bronze for ceramic production made without rotary tool and probably operating in the framework of a household industry. So given the fact that the wheel-made northern ceramic tradition expanded at the same pace than the fortified cities and swept literally the ancient ceramic production, the hypothesis has been that wheel-made ceramics proliferated in the southern Levant through the expansion of the fortified cities and the palaces, which brought along their specialized craftsmen. In other words, the rapid spreading of the wheel-forming technique testifies to the arrival of a new population along a new socioeconomic system. This conjectural event, namely crisis, entailed a major social discontinuity in the history of the southern Levant, with the implementation of a new population and a new context of production. The example of the passage from the EB4 to the Middle Bronze Age 2 is one example out of others. I could have the same way underlined the differences between the EB4 ceramic assemblages and the EB3 ceramic assemblages, which included wheel-made ceramics. The same way I would have shown that they correspond to different technological traditions and therefore to different social groups, implying that the EB4 reflects upon a new population sociology, and therefore that change in the technological tradition indicates a crisis marked at that time by the collapse of the EB3 cities. And I would say, to finish on these examples, I would say as a general principle, it's important to say that complete change in technological tradition can indicate crisis, because then it signals a break in the transmission process, in the transmission chain, and therefore that a new social component has emerged or has disappeared. So I will now consider the transitional periods. As said previously, transitional periods are also called periods of trouble. Generally, new traits are introduced, coexisting with ancient ones, and leading to periods of in-between, of disorder, as compared to other periods. And as a consequence, as I said before, they are then very difficult periods to be interpreted in terms of population structure. The disorder witnessed by the transitional periods imply that technological clusters do not form anymore, which therefore questions the rules of transmission at the origin of clear-cut, well-defined clusters. So in order to better understand this phenomenon of disorder, which contrasts with linear progressive introduction of new traits, I propose to report on an ethnographic case where ceramic firing structures have recently changed and are still going to change, are still under change. So the case study takes place in Rajasthan, in India, in the region of Jodhpur. The ceramic production over there is in the hands of Muslim and Hindu potters who live in the same or in separate villages. Until 1987, the technical systems were differentiating very clearly the two social groups. The differences were particularly visible in the wheel instrument, not same type of wheel, the paddling tool, not same shape of the paddles, and the firing structure. The Hindu firing structures were open, circular with multiple peripheral hearth, whereas the Muslim firing structures were open, triangular, with unique hearth. And so the variability of the technical systems was then reflecting very well the structure of the potters' population. Then from 1987 onwards, the firing structure started to change. The kiln was introduced through one potter of the village of Sar. This potter had gone to Gujarat, where the kiln was used, and he brought back the idea when he came back. It was followed by its adoption and diffusion within the Muslim population, which itself experienced what we could call a demic expansion at the expense of the Hindu population potter, the latter gradually abandoning the profession the past 30 years due to a shift from a barter economy to a cash economy. As for the spreading of the kiln among the still active Hindu potters, it wasn't done by direct interaction with the Muslim potters, but by interaction with the potters of the distant city of Mokatsar in connection with the production of a new type of water jars originally manufactured by the Hindu potters of the city and correlated with the use of the kiln. As a result, nowadays, in 2015, the spatial variability of the firing structures doesn't distinguish anymore the two potter communities. The replacement of the two pre-existing firing techniques by a single new tradition, in a way, is another good example of a marker of crisis. Here, the crisis corresponding to a major change in the modalities of the ceramic production. As I told you, this shift between from barter to cash economy, and the consequent change in the sociology of the potters, who include less and less Hindu potters and more Muslim potters. Nevertheless, there is one town, Pachpadra, which appears as a particular case in the sense that nowadays 3 firing structures are used instead of a single previously, including a kiln of a different type as compared to the one found in the region, the main difference being the floor, which is, for the one used in the region, corresponds to metallic blades resting on a small central pillar, whereas in Pachpadra, the central pillar is very large and the blades very short. The town of Pachpadra is a renowned center for the manufacturing of water jars since more than 50 years. It is about a town of about 10,000 inhabitants with a tightened urban fabric and a neighborhood of 38 potter households. Today, the 38 households use 3 firing structures. 5 of them use open firing, 11 walled firings, and 22 vertical updraft kiln. The open firing, is the traditional one, which was used by the Hindu potters of the region. Namely, it's circular open firing with multiple earth. They allow potters to fire several hundred containers at a time, up to 800 water jars at a time. Walled firing were introduced in 1995 by a regional organization for the promotion of handicrafts. These walled firing work exactly according to the same principle as the open firing and allow also the firing of several hundred containers at a time, the amount, of course, depending on the diameter of the wall. The vertical updraft kiln was also introduced in 1998 by an organization for the promotion of handicrafts. The goal was to have the potters making glazed figurines that could represent a new economic outlet. However, it appeared quickly that this was not a profitable idea, and so the kiln wasn't adopted, except by one potter who in 2005 had the idea of using it for firing water jars and then initiating the diffusion of the kiln in the town of Patchpadra. And the kiln enables the potter to fire between 80 to 100 containers at a time. Each of these firing structures has advantages and disadvantages highlighted by the potters when asked to explain which one they prefer and why they choose to use one rather than another one. In general, those who choose the open firing say that they prefer it because it allows them to fire several hundred containers at a time and therefore to have a single firing per month. Furthermore, according to the potters, open firing prevents them from having a fixed structure that takes space and imposes a certain number of containers to be fired. Those who choose the walled firing said they prefer it because the enclosure protects the firing from wind blows. In addition, it allows them not to cover the sides of the firing structure with shirts, saving time when preparing the firing. At last, like the open firings, the walled firing allows them to fire a sufficiently large number of containers to make only 1 to 2 firings per month. Now, those who choose the kiln justify their choice by explaining that the kiln uses 1.5 less fuel, that the preparation of the firing is much faster since it takes only 2 hours instead of 7, and finally, that they have no problem with firing every week or even every 3 days in some cases. Now let us look at the sociological composition of the Patchpadra potters. These potters, they're all Hindu and belong to the caste Prajapat. They fall into 2 main endogamous subcastes, the Banda, which gathers 18 households, and the Purubiya, which gathers 20 households. Each of these subcastes includes clans, which are called Gotra, that are exogamous. Each clan includes lineages, which gather individuals from the same ancestor and comprise a more or less large number of households. Comparing the Banda and the Purubiya, we observe that Banda form a more homogeneous group in the sense that the clan Godela, gathering most of the families, is formed of a single lineage, whereas in Purubiya, the clan gathering most of the families includes 7 distinct lineages. If we now examine the variability of firing structures depending on sociological composition of the population, we observe that it doesn't vary according to the subcaste. Indeed, there is an almost equal number of different firing structures within Purubiya and Banda. And for two examples, one having both open firing and kiln and walled firing and kiln. In contrast, at the scale of the clan, we can observe, firstly, that there is an intra-clan variability of the firing structures among the Purubiya, the majority clan having 5 different technical modes of firing, one household having both the kiln and the walled firing, and another household so having both the kiln and the open firing. Secondly, that this intra-clan variability of the firing structure is also observable in Banda with the Gotra Kavadia. And finally, that this variability contrasts with the uniformity of the firing structure in the clan Godela, as you can see in orange. To understand both the variability and uniformity within each clan, I now propose to examine the kiln diffusion process, knowing that the kiln has become predominant in the whole Jodhpur area and is in the process to become the majority firing structure in Pachpadra. If one compares first the rates of adoption of the kiln depending on the two subcastes, it is observed that they are comparable. From this point of view, the pace of adoption of the kiln by the subcastes do not inform about what generated the intra-clan variability. As for the diffusion process, we examined the relationship between the parental network and the distribution network, as well as the kinship relationship between all the porters who have adopted the kiln. So the results are as follows. First, we can see that at the global level, at the Pachpadra level, there is a statistically significant correlation between the parental network and the diffusion network, and between the people who have adopted the kiln. This means that the adoption of the kiln is mainly under the influence of a potter with a family relationship. At the subcaste level, it appears, on the one hand, that the correlation between the parental network and the diffusion network is higher in Banda than in Purubiya. On the other hand, that there is in Banda, and unlike in Purubiya, a significant correlation between the network of people who have adopted the kiln and the parental network, thus indicating that the potters who brought the kiln are close relatives. Finally, at the clan level, it appears that the correlation between the diffusion network and the parental network is stronger among the Godela, who are Banda, followed by the Enia, who are Purubiya. So in summary, there are correlation between the adoption network and the parental network, which are stronger in Banda than in Purubiya. This partly explains the uniformity of the firing structure in Godela from the Banda caste that has, I recall, only one lineage. This also partly explains that there is more variability in the firing structures in Purubiya, which includes more lineages than Banda. But this is only a partial explanation, knowing that in Banda there is also a clan which shows a high variability of firing structure. So one must here consider the learning strategies of the kiln, which have been the two kinds. Individual learning by trial and error, and social learning with a tutor, mostly parents. Individual learning characterized by testing the different firing structures with occasional regresses, namely returning to the initial firing structures, was mainly observed in the majority clan and lineage Purubia. This individual learning was initiated by the potter Govind, the first one to have tested the kiln in Pachpadra. He then tested the wall firing between 2003 and 2005 before returning to the open firing while adopting the kiln again, that he destroyed in 2009. This individual learning is also observed in Banda, but in a minority clan, the Kavadia. It was initiated by the potter Pukraj, the first potter to have tested the walled firing. He then borrowed the kiln in 2009, for which he tested different sizes, resulting in numerous difficulties and failures. And currently, he only uses the wall firing. Even if the kiln is still present in his courtyard, still he uses it as a storage space. On the contrary, in Godela, the Banda majority clan, social learning within the parental network prevails. So it was initiated by the potter Jagdish, the innovator of the kiln in 2005, and who never subsequently changed of technical behavior. These results enable to understand the variability of the firing structures in Pachpadra and why this variability is not correlated with the potter sociological structure. This variability is the product of two factors, the parental network and the learning strategy. The parental network has involved a differential distribution between Banda and Purubia, knowing that Purubia have a greater number of lineages than Banda, and therefore a more fragmental parental mesh. The importance of the parental mesh in the diffusion process has also been observed at the regional level, where it could be demonstrated that the adoption of the kiln by the potters of the Jodhpur district was faster among Muslims than among the Hindus, given a much tighter parental mesh. And that you can see here with the two curves of adoption. The red curve corresponds to the rate of adoption of the kiln by the Muslim potter, the blue one by the Hindu potters. And very briefly, they don't have the same matrimonial alliances system, which makes that the Hindu have a much looser mesh, social parental mesh than the Muslim one, which have this very, very tight parental mesh. As for the learning strategy, they also imply a differential diffusion between Banda and Purubia. Social learning, which is to copy a model, played in favor of the diffusion of the model with the effect of gradually generating homogeneous tradition, what we could call, a continuous change. Instead, individual learning has been an obstacle to the diffusion process by promoting for a given time the absence of selection of one of the firing structure and therefore persistence of the diversity of technical features. As you could see here with this example shown by a household who used to fire pots in the open and during monsoon time in kilns, refusing at that time, that is in 2013, to take the walled firing because he was saying it was taking too much space, especially, he couldn't park his tractor. So he needed to have this open space. Then the next year when I came, then there was a walled firing and the kiln had been destroyed. And then when I say, but what about the space? He said, oh, but I managed, no problem. So in summary, let us underline that a detailed example study of Pachpadra has enabled to unveil the mechanism at work in the emergence of cultural variability at the intrasite level, as observed also during so-called transitional trouble periods. The transformation underwent by Patchpadra are not related to a crisis per se, but rather to economic and technological transformation. These transformations are specific to the Jodhpur region. However, we may question the generality of the process that generated the observed variability and then the context in which it operates. This process describes a non-linear adoption of new technical options marked by an absence of selection of traits, and that's a form of disorder, emphasized by the successive appearance and disappearance of various firing techniques at the individual level. This process is opposed to the one that promotes a gradual adoption of a linear type, resulting in a progressive uniformity of techniques. The consequence of this differential adoption process is a technological variability that is not meaningful in terms of social groups. Nonlinear adoption of techniques is here observed in a context where the community is heterogeneous, where several technique options were introduced, and where different learning strategies were followed. At Patchpadra, social heterogeneity corresponds to the number of lineages per clans, but it could equally correspond, for example, to age group, with a consequent differential adoption of technical option depending on generations and on the initial borrower's age group. And we do have historical example showing the importance of the age group, in this behavior towards adoption of new techniques. Well, I think that we all even have in mind this kind of differential adoption depending on age. Indeed, the heterogeneity of Patchpadra community must be considered from a generic point of view when taking a diffusion network perspective. The importance of relation also between adopters and innovators in the process of adopting techniques having been widely established in sociology. As for the learning strategies, these have also been recognized as an important factor in the different modalities of diffusion. How case study shows in an original way that different learning strategies were developed at the intrasite level. And here one may wonder, in fact, to what extent the community structure has encouraged the development of these different strategies, knowing that at the time of the introduction of the Kiln, the two initial adopters didn't have the same strategy, while not belonging to the same subcaste. At last, let us note that the variability here investigated was observed so then at the intrasite level. In archaeology, such an intravariability of firing structure, in fact, is known. There is a beautiful example in Mesopotamia on a site which is called Telferes, dated from the end of the Ubaid periods, where you do have within same workshops this appearance, disappearance of different varying structure. And this is a time which is just before the beginning, of the proto-urbanization period in this area. So that has been also this intra-level variability, intrasite variability has been also observed in archaeology. But in fact, a similar variability could be considered at the intersite, of course, level when comparable conditions are met, that is, introduction of several technical options, social heterogeneity between settlements, and variable learning strategies. So once recognized that the variability observed is not significant of the population structure, interpreting the transformations at play will require then necessarily to call upon the contextual data, since then by definition they are historical, that is to say particular and not reproducible. Thank you very much for your attention.